The Mycenaean civilization was the first powerful military culture of ancient Greece. The Mycenaeans came from the grasslands of Russia. Around 2000 BCE, small groups started making their way west into Europe and then south through the Balkan Peninsula. Finally, they settled in the lowlands of Greece. These herders and warriors from the mainland took advantage of the Minoans' weakened state to conquer Crete and assume dominance of the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean world. Mycenae has been the focus of many archaeological excavations and investigations throughout the last several centuries, most notably with the work of Heinrich Schliemann, a noted anthropologist whose attempts to locate the legendary city of Troy helped to unearth a treasure trove of fortified palace complexes, burial tombs, and a cache of gold and bronze items. Mycenae was located on a hill with steep slopes to the north and a chasm to the south. Entrance was from the gentler slope on the west side, which had a narrow opening which could be easily fortified. The Lion's Gate was positioned above the main entrance to the citadel of Mycenae. The gate was about 10 feet wide and 10 feet high. The carved stone with the lions is about 3 feet high. It forms what is called a relieving triangle because the carved slab weighs much less than the stones to the right and the left. This reduced pressure on the lintel block below it. That block weighs 2 tons or so. The door was made up of 2 wooden leaves opening inward. The Mycenaeans built massive citadels with strong walls made of huge stones. The characteristic of the Mycenaean walls is that they are made of huge limestone boulders, which have been fitted together rather roughly. As these boulders are very big in size, the ancient people believed that it was the Cyclops who built these gates, as they thought it impossible for men to move such big rocks. That is why the walls are named Cyclopean walls. The Mycenaean kings built these fortresses on hilltops. Each Mycenaean city was remotely located and heavily fortified, obviously due to their fondness for conquest throughout the Aegean region. In times of danger or attack, the people in the villages outside the palace walls took shelter within the palace. Its chief feature was the Megaron, or square room with a fireplace in its center. The king held council meetings and entertained in the Megaron. The Megaron was a unique feature of mainland architecture and could be found in the royal palaces as well as in many of the larger private homes. A Megaron is essentially a freestanding unit composed of a more or less square room entered at one side through a porch with 2 columns. The principal room was dominated by a round, fixed hearth. Smoke from the hearth was allowed to escape through an opening in the roof. The ceiling was held up with 4 columns evenly placed in a square around the hearth. Against the wall opposite the entrance was a throne situated on a raised platform. The central hearth and the presence of the royal in the room was suggested to some that the Megaron was the location of Mycenaean religion. The Megaron was an early step in the evolution of the classic Greek temple. Shortly after the Mycenaeans settled in the lowlands of Greece, they were visited by Minoan traders from Crete. The Mycenaeans began to imitate Minoan gold and bronze work. They adapted Cretan script to their own language. Known as Linear B, it has proved to be the oldest surviving record of these people. The script was discovered by archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans during excavations in the Greek mainland. It was deciphered by Michael Ventris. The majority of the clay tablets seem to be ancient accounting records composed of lists of materials and goods. They copied Minoan fashions. Most important of all, they learned how to build ships and how to navigate using the sun and the stars to travel on the sea. The Mycenaeans also began to grow olives. They made presses to squeeze oil from the olives. They used the oil for cooking, as fuel for lamps, and to rub on their bodies. They sold plain oil in large clay jars and perfumed oil in painted vases. Sale of the oil made the Mycenaeans rich. It also led to the founding of trading stations and settlements on nearby islands. Despite their success in trade, the Mycenaeans were warriors at heart. In battle, they used large hide shields with wooden frames and fought with spears and swords. Their leaders wore fancy bronze armor. At first, the Mycenaeans fought one another. After they learned about shipbuilding and navigation, they outfitted pirate fleets and began to raid nearby islands. By about 1400 BCE, they had replaced the Minoans as the chief power in the Mediterranean. There were different levels of Mycenaean society. Many free persons did not own their own land, but farmed that owned land either by the palace or by the wealthy. These were tenants who lived on and worked in others' land. They would be required to give a certain proportion of their produce to the owner of their land, and had to live off the rest. These persons were not slaves, of course, but would to some extent be subject to the will of the landowners, who could change their rent or even evict them. Other farmers were lucky enough to own their land. They gave the palace some sort of produce in tax, service in the army in the event of war, and perhaps also some labor, of the sort necessary to build the huge walls and other engineering feats of the Mycenaeans, dams, bridges, etc. But they would have otherwise been left largely to their own devices. Although they kept large herds of cattle, the Mycenaeans relied on hunting to get more meat. They hunted rabbit, deer, boar, wild bulls, and game birds. Women rode in with the men in chariots during the hunt. When hunters were after big game, they used greyhounds. The game was captured with nets or killed with spears, slings or bows, and arrows. The Wanax was the term applied to the leader. He was expected to lead the army in war, and in times of peace, the palace kept track of all daily business. The Wanax was also the chief religious figure. The Mycenaeans were famous for their attack on Troy, a major trading city and competitor in Asia Minor. This attack probably took place during the mid-1200s BCE. At the time, the Trojans controlled trade routes to the Black Sea. They made money by taxing the ships that carried grain and gold from southern Russia to Greece. About 500 years after the Mycenaeans attacked Troy, a blind poet named Homer composed a long poem about the event. He called his poem the Iliad. Homer also composed a poem called the Odyssey, which tells about the wanderings of Odysseus, a Mycenaean hero of the Trojan War. Homer drew his material from the two poems from songs and legends that had been handed down by word of mouth. He then added his own description and details of everyday life. According to Homer's account, the Trojan War was fought over a woman. The king of Troy had a son named Paris, who fell in love with Helen, the wife of a Mycenaean king. When Paris took Helen to Troy, her husband formed an army and sailed after them. However, the walls of Troy were so tall, thick, and strong that the Mycenaeans could not get into the city. They had to camp on the plain outside the city walls. After 10 years of fighting, the Mycenaeans still had not taken Troy. Then Odysseus suggested a way that they could capture the city. He had his soldiers build a huge, hollow wooden horse. The best soldiers hid inside the horse, while the rest boarded ships and sailed away. The Trojans saw the ships leave, and they thought they had won the war. They did not know that the Mycenaean ships would return after dark. The Trojans tied ropes to the wooden horse and pulled it into the city as a victory prize. When they fell asleep, the Mycenaean soldiers, hidden inside, the horse came out. They opened the city gates and let the rest of the Mycenaean army in. The Mycenaeans killed the king of Troy and burned the city. Then, with Helen, they returned to their homes. The Mycenaeans did not return to peaceful ways after crushing Troy. A series of civil wars broke out among the people of the mainland. As a result, the Mycenaeans were weakened, and almost no fortress palaces were left. The Dorians entered Greece and conquered the Mycenaeans using stronger iron weapons. Thousands of Mycenaeans fled and settled on Aegean islands, or on the western shore of Asia Minor, which became known as Ionia. As a result of the civil wars and Dorian invasion, the Greek world entered into a dark age, which lasted almost 400 years. It was a time of wandering and killing. Overseas trade stopped. The people forgot how to read and keep records. The skills of fresco painting and working with precious metals disappeared. Greece was cut off from the Middle East, and the people had to create a new civilization on their own. They started over. Once again, herding and farming became the main ways of life. Local leaders ruled small areas. At first, the borders of the areas they ruled kept changing. In time, however, the borders became fixed, and each area became an independent community. The people of these communities began calling themselves Hellenes, or Greeks. They worked hard to redevelop their culture and learn new crafts and skills. The civilization they created lasted for over 1,000 years.
For 40 years, the English archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans labored to find the historical truths behind Greek myth. Two questions about the Minoans remained unanswered: their language and their demise. After Evans' death, a Greek archaeologist named Spiridon Marinatos picks up the trail. Marinatos gets his first clue in 1932. He digs at a site called Amnisos on the north coast of Crete, a town described by the blind poet Homer as the port of royal Knossos.
We're at the site of Amnisos in the center of the north coast of Crete, where Marinatos excavated this marvelous Minoan villa, which has been nicknamed the Villa of the Lilies after the frescoes which were found inside the villa. At one part of the site he found great cut blocks which had been shifted out of place, which he attributed to a tsunami or tidal wave. All around here one finds pieces of pumice which are clearly from this Minoan eruption itself, and even on top of this hill here we today have found pieces of pumice which surely can only have got here with a tsunami or tidal wave.
What could have set off such a deadly wave? The answer dawns on Marinatos. 75 miles north of Crete, an island called Santorini. An island that was rocked by an ancient cataclysm hundreds of times more powerful than a hydrogen bomb. Santorini. A stark, volcanic landscape whose sheer cliffs are all that remain after a fiery catastrophe that ripped out the heart of the island. Marinatos is convinced. The catastrophe that obliterated the Minoan world is the same one described in the most famous of all Greek legends, the lost continent of Atlantis, recorded by the greatest of all philosophers, Plato.
In this island of Atlantis had arisen a great and wonderful monarchy, which ruled the whole island as well as many others and parts of the mainland. But afterwards came a time of earthquakes and disasters. In one terrible day and night, Atlantis sank into the sea and vanished.
Plato chronicled the myth of Atlantis in 300 BC, 400 years after Homer's Iliad, 1,000 years after the end of the great Minoan Empire. Was Plato writing a fable or transcribing history? Marinatos believes the legend is a distorted memory of the destruction which befell Crete and Santorini. Atlantis, as described by Plato, bears an uncanny similarity to the Minoan world discovered by Arthur Evans on Crete. Plato repeatedly describes the Atlanteans' obsession with the mighty bull.
In the sanctuary of the city, bulls roamed at large. The princes hunted them with wooden staves and ropes, but with no weapons of iron. When the bull was captured, they brought him to a column and slew him over it, drenching the inscription with his blood.
Plato describes the geography of the island, again resembling Crete.
The whole country was said to be surrounded by mountains which descended toward the sea. The mountains were celebrated for their beauty.
Marinatos believes the Minoans were the people of Atlantis. He's convinced a great secret lies waiting to be discovered on Santorini. 30 years will pass before he can test his theory. In 1941, Hitler's Blitzkrieg reaches the shores of Crete. Hundreds of patriots are killed. Arthur Evans' home, the Villa Ariadne, is commandeered as Nazi headquarters. Then, at war's end, a bloody revolution in Greece renders field work impossible.
This was once the power base of the Minoan civilization, an advanced maritime race who controlled the wealth and trade of the Mediterranean. More formidable still were the stories of the island's infamous King Minos. In Greek mythology, he's said to have built a labyrinth to cage a monster. Half man, half bull, the Minotaur was the shocking result of a union between a sacred bull and the king's unfaithful wife. Legend recalls that the Minotaur thirsted for human blood. As ruler of the seas, King Minos is said to have forced the Greeks to send 7 young men and women to be sacrificed. And according to the legend, they were taken down into the labyrinth to be eaten alive. Today on the island, the remains of the Palace of Knossos can still be seen. Could this building once have housed the most terrible creations from the ancient Greeks' mythical past? Or did the structure of the palace inspire the story of the Minotaur? Built some 2,000 years before the Greek world flourished, the palace contained hundreds of luxurious rooms. But did horror lurk deep beneath the splendor? In 1900, an English archaeologist decided to find out. Sir Arthur Evans began to excavate what he believed could be the legendary palace. Evans soon discovered a stone seat. Could this be a throne, or perhaps proof that the king really existed? Evans sent a telegram to the King of Greece, inviting him to sit on what he believed was the oldest throne in Europe. As Evans dug, a magnificent palace began to emerge. Covering an area of 20,000 square yards, it revealed astonishing technical feats of the Bronze Age people Evans called the Minoans. From little more than foundations, Evans was able to reconstruct a part of the palace to create a glimpse of a lost culture.
One could say that the Minoans were truly remarkable in the building technologies. They invented certain techniques and methods that were a breakthrough at that time.
One innovation was a series of terraces dug into the hillside to create the palace's east wing, which stood 4 stories high. Another was the grand staircase running up inside the palace. It was supported by cedar wood pillars.
It's a masterpiece in many ways, because it's no easy thing to build a staircase going down 2 flights on a wooden frame.
The diameter of each column defines its maximum load. 3,500 years ago, the Minoans calculated how to make the strongest framework possible by placing these columns directly beneath one another. And they outstripped all other contemporary civilizations in their mastery of light, using light wells and windows on a scale never seen before. To control internal light and space, the ancient architects created a groundbreaking system of doors. The palace boasted an elaborate underfloor drainage system. This not only dealt with Crete's rainfall, it also carried away waste from one of the world's earliest toilets.
This is the famous toilet of the Minoan palace. Outside these doors, you see this large slab, and we have here a hole. So somebody, let's say a servant, was outside flushing water as the toilet was being used.
Leading to the palace were the very first cobbled roads in Europe, built over 1,000 years before the Romans. There were even sidewalks for pedestrians. It became clear that Knossos lay at the heart of a highly sophisticated civilization. So why did Sir Arthur Evans link it with the myth of the Minotaur in its labyrinth? He found a number of clues, including strange engravings in the shape of a double-headed axe. What was their secret meaning?
We have no idea what these were for, because some were meant to be seen, others were not meant to be seen. Some were covered with plaster, others are on the undersides of stones. But what does seem clear is that they had some kind of magical component.
An ancient word for this axe is labyrinth. Evans believed this palace could be the very origin of the word labyrinth. Another clue linking the palace to the myth is the layout itself. 1,500 interconnecting rooms, many below ground. A bewildering maze that would drive outsiders to panic. Rather than being the actual site of Minos' mythical labyrinth, built to imprison the Minotaur, could the maze-like palace in fact have given rise to the story? A possibility backed up by evidence that the bull, an ancient symbol of power, played a key role in Minoan life. Experts now think the Minotaur myth evolved when the powerful Cretans controlled the seas, demanding tributes from lesser states, such as Athens. According to legend, the Athenian hero Theseus volunteered to confront the monster. Armed with just a sword and string to mark his path through the labyrinth, Theseus the Athenian confronted the Minotaur, slaying the beast. The Athenians promoted this story. It made them look victorious. But in reality, Athens was at this time only a minor city when the powerful palace of Knossos flourished. And if King Minos had existed only in a legend, who was it who'd sat upon this throne?
The ancient legends, I think, very much colored Saratha's view of Minoan culture. Today, we believe that actually a priestess may have sat here, because in other artistic media, we always see a woman, priestess or goddess, with griffins heraldically placed on either side of her.
Whether or not King Minos existed only in myth, the 3,500-year-old palace at Knossos still strikes awe in its visitors today. There is no doubt that this great palace could inspire storytellers, or that its architecture would inspire the Minoan successors, the ancient Greeks.